distinguished guests, friends from far away and from near, colleagues, you are most welcome to the Swedish Defence University. This is truly a day of celebration. To be honest, I can't remember this level of interest when I assumed my professorship, but I'm not bitter. But first of all, we are, of course, delighted to welcome our inaugural Anna Lindh Chair of Gender, Peace and Security, Professor Annick Wibben. But we are also incredibly honored to welcome our Swedish Foreign Minister, Her Excellency Margot Wallström, who for the last 4 years have launched, developed, and implemented a feminist foreign policy. My name is Robert Egnell. I'm a professor of leadership and head of the Department of Security, Strategy and Leadership here at the university. And might I also add, a staunch supporter of feminist and gender approaches in the academic life as well as in policy life. So what we have here today is a meeting of two great champions of gender equality, of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and of women's and human rights in general. But we are also witnessing a meeting of theory and practice, of the academy and of the professions we seek to develop at this university. And these are the types of meetings that the Defence University seek to embody. That's what we're all about, and that's what our students come here to witness and to enjoy. And that's what I think makes us uniquely placed within the academic community of Sweden as well, and internationally. Last year, this school celebrated a number of anniversaries. We celebrated 200 years as a military academy. We also celebrated 10 years as a civilian college or university, we're allowed to say in English. But we also celebrated the birth of our current nature, which means we received the right to issue degrees at all levels, which now means that we have a number of international 2-year master's programs up and running with incredible interest from students all around Sweden and also internationally. And tomorrow we will also welcome our very own first batch of PhD students to the Swedish Defence University. So we can hardly catch our breath from all the celebrations we have right now at the Swedish Defence University. First, I would like to say a few words about the two main speakers of today. Professor Annick Wibben, who we somehow have managed to convince to move from San Francisco to Stockholm, was previously a professor of politics and international studies, as well as the director of the Peace and Justice Studies program at the University of San Francisco. She's a really well-renowned scholar on these issues, most frequently associated with the field of feminist security studies. And her work traverses the fields of critical security and military studies, international theory, feminist international relations, and most recently also feminist foreign policy. She is currently the vice chair of the Women's Caucus in the International Studies and has recently also been the chair of the Feminist Theory and Gender Studies sections of the International Studies Association. She holds a PhD from the University of Wales, Aberystwyth. And I cannot stress enough how honored we are to welcome you to Stockholm. But first, I would like to introduce to the floor our Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, who has not only been a foreign minister, of course, but before that was the United Nations Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict from 2010 to 2012. She was also the Vice President of the European Commission and European Commissioner for Institutional Relations and Communications Strategy from 2004 to 2010. A long and distinguished career nationally and internationally in politics. And might I add, also my co-conspirator in making all of this happen today. So So very welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Vice Chancellor Enmark, Professor Wibben, dear friends, thank you for inviting me to speak today at this inaugural lecture. I forgot my real glasses, so I'm not sure exactly what will happen here when I try to read and look at you, but we'll try. I know that this is not your first time here in Stockholm, Professor Wibben, but we are, as Robert Ignell already said, extremely happy to welcome you here, and congratulations to this post and your appointment, and congratulations to the Swedish Defense University for receiving a professor with such excellent qualifications and knowing so much about and doing research on security and military studies, international theory, and feminist international relations. And I'm delighted that the idea of an Anna Lindh professor at the Swedish Defense University has now become a reality. And it was an idea that Robert Ignell and I came up with when we sat in my office discussing the best ways to advance the cause of women, peace, and security. And as many of you already know, one of my highest priorities during the past 4 years has been one of pursuing a feminist foreign policy. And I will not try to keep this short because I know that everybody is most eager to listen to you and your lecture, Professor Wibben. But I would like to say just a few words, first about Anna Lindh and her legacy, and then give a very concrete example of how I think that the feminist foreign policy should be pursued. And I take it from our experience from the Security Council and what is on the international political agenda at the moment. And that is the role of women in the Colombian peace process. As you might know already, Anna Lindh was a close friend of mine. And I think we all, and I in particular, of course, miss her immensely following her brutal murder in 2003. And unfortunately, her time in this world was too short. Anna told me the story about when she once took her oldest son with her to visit the UN in New York. And she took him to the headquarters, and they, of course, went to the General Assembly. They walked in the corridors. They were looking at the pieces of art that is on display. Also in the headquarters, they went to the Security Council. And she understood that her son really enjoyed the visit and was very curious and interested. But they soon noticed that wherever they went, there were lots of men in dark suits. And Anna's youngest son looked out at the General Assembly Hall, and then finally turned to her and said, "And the girls, do they come later?" And sometimes it takes a child to speak the truth, and this surely was one of these occasions. Where are the women? Is a phrase that I've used too many times in political life. The lack of women in everything from decision-making to peace negotiations and economic life is still outrageous, and is something that I know inspired so much of Anna Lindh's work, also as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. You are perhaps aware that when the formal, well, this is also why I think it is so important that we call it the Anna Lindh Professor. And I think she would have been extremely happy on a day like this. When the formal peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC began in Havana, Cuba in November 2012, only one of the 20 negotiators around the table was a woman. A year later, civil society leaders organized the first ever national summit of women and peace. And out of that summit came a clear demand for an inclusive peace process. And let me say that before that, when I was a special representative of the UN on conflict-related sexual violence, I was invited to a huge meeting also in Colombia, looking at the role of victims. And this was, I would say, something that really changed my life in a way, but I can talk more about that later. But out of this summit, the National Summit on Women and Peace, came a clear demand for a more inclusive peace process. And 2 years later, women made up 20% of the government's negotiating team and 43% of the FARC delegates. So what happened? Well, by organizing themselves, these women contributed in crucial ways to the peacemaking effort, including by broadening the agenda. And this is the experience, I think, and maybe we'll hear more about that. Women addressed some of the primary grievances of affected communities, such as land restitution and the right to justice and reparations for victims. And women also negotiated local ceasefires, which improved the local security situation in towns and villages across Colombia. Because of demands by women negotiators and civil society, FARC also undertook several confidence-building measures, such as an apology process and the release of child soldiers. And this was also sort of coming from the desperate needs of women who saw this in their daily lives. And finally, women built coalitions and rallied public support in favor of the peace talks. So by repairing relations in communities affected by the conflict, women and civil society laid the groundwork for the peace-building efforts necessary for the success of the agreement. The peace agreement in Colombia, I think, serves as a model for inclusion. Women were key to its success, not to say that they have succeeded. There are still so many problems in the peace process as such, but that's a partly different story that has to do with many other components as well. But women's continued involvement will continue to be key to the implementation of the peace process and to consolidating. So this is just one of the many ways in which gender equality is it's not just a women's issue, as I keep saying, it's a peace and security issue. This is why it is a concern and should be an engagement from all of us, women and men, not a women's issue. And I'm very happy and proud that Sweden now has an academic center for women, peace and security studies here at the Swedish Defense University. And I'm convinced that this will contribute to advancing gender equality in peace processes and security policy, thus contributing to peace itself. And with this, I'm happy and proud to give the floor to Professor Annick Bibben. Thank you.
was a lot of introductions, and I already was so nervous before. So, give me just a moment. Pour some water. Very excited. Oh my goodness, there's so many people. Very excited to be here. Dear Minister Wallström, Chancellor and Mark, and assembled guests, it's an absolute honor to be chosen as the first Anna Lindh Professor for Gender, Peace and Security. And to speak to you today about this important work that feminist scholars, some of whom are in the room actually today, which is exciting, have been doing for many years to bring these issues to the forefront, to help policymakers do their work, to incorporate the kind of work that activists have been doing, and to have this sort of three-way conversation between scholars, activists, and policymakers about these issues. So in what follows now in the next time, I want to lay out in some very broad strokes, some of the scholars broad in my strokes, what we mean when we talk about feminist perspectives, plural, on gender, peace and security, war, conflict transformation, international justice. And also sort of the why and the how, right? So let me talk initially a little bit about feminism. And I know I'm in Sweden, and I'm told that Swedish people know what feminism is. But let me just give you a little bit of an idea of how I work with the concepts in very broad strokes. So for me, after many years of thinking, which we academics do, we think and we think some more, feminism can broadly be described as a political project to make the world a better place for women. So that sounds fairly straightforward. But of course, it's not at all straightforward, right? The world looks quite different depending on where you stand, or it in your case today. What is better for some might not be liberating for others. And hence, we are often having a hard time agreeing on what better actually means, right? And last and certainly not least, what defines women is not as straightforward as it might seem. And what is more, what makes a woman, or a man for that matter, is always relational. It means we cannot have an understanding of what it means to be a woman or walk through the world as a woman or experience violence as a woman without at the same time having corresponding notions of masculinity, what it means to be a man, as scholars such as Raewyn Connell have well documented. So consequently, while feminists would argue that making the world better for women, such that they are able to live less violent and more fulfilling lives, will also mean that men are better off, clearly the shifts that are required for men and from men to accommodate women's aspirations for more equality or equity also imply that men have to reflect on and disavow the many privileges they have enjoyed due to the subordination of women. And what is more than that even is, as Bell Hooks reminds us, is that not all men or all women amongst themselves are actually equal, which means that shifts in gender relations alongside class, race, religion, ability, and other kinds of relations also necessitate renegotiations of the relationships among men and among women, right, in the categories. So there's a lot of shifting going on, if you just notice this, yes? And this means that feminism as a political project often becomes quite personal, right? So this is one of the issues I want you to think about. And feminists say this, the personal is political. Fortunately, feminist scholars do not have to rely on a uniform understanding of women or men to do our work. We can stress diversity among women even when using a singular notion to talk about them. Indeed, I like to think about it in this way. We can focus on those who are identified as women, right? So we're thinking about, we all have understandings of who women are. And doing so highlights the social positioning associated with womanhood, rather than some sort of essential characteristics or traits of women. Christine Sylvester has proposed to think of women as stick figures, while also realizing that we could not possibly talk to stick figures. So in reality, women are always going to be more complex than a stick figure. In other words, while researchers often need to think about men or women as a group, and of the structures that make it necessary to think of them as such, and that affect their daily lives as they walk through the world as women or men, we also need to, at the same time, pay attention to the ways in which individual women and men are situated in a variety of contexts, which shape their personal experience in the world, but also what they can do and how they can live their lives. And how they are, talking about peace and security, often subject to violence. To summarize this very first part, what these different concepts that make up my working definition of feminism describe is always contextually specific and needs to be very carefully established as each research process progresses. And hence, feminists pay a lot of attention to reflexivity throughout the various phases of a research process, from the formulation of a research question, where, as feminist philosopher Sandra Harding has notes, a lot of bias gets established in that very moment of thinking about what are we studying, or where do we place our policy emphasis, or where do we place our activist energies, to the selection of appropriate methods, one of my favorite topics. Anybody want to talk methods? Find me. Or the data collection, the evaluation of data, and the presentation. Reflexivity throughout the process is key. And it is enhanced, I would argue, when scholars, activists, and policymakers engage with each other. Because through our different ways of thinking about the world, we are pushing each other to be clearer, we are pushing each other to think harder, and we are pushing each other to really think about what the better part of this definition is. Unfortunately, because feminism is a political project, it often is attacked as such, or it's not taken seriously, right? Because it's just politics. So examples include, for example, the recent bomb threat right here in Sweden at the National Gender Secretariat at the University of Gothenburg. Göteborg? That's okay. But also attacks on gender studies in Hungary and Poland, both EU members. And just last week, the announcement of the new president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who said that he would fight the ideology of gender teaching. Inside academia, I've been able to observe firsthand as a scholar and, of course, a longtime advocate for feminist and other critical scholarship, that feminism is often dismissed in as a political project in a way that is quite insidious, because there is a claim associated with other kinds of research that it somehow is neutral, that traditional research is neutral and critical or feminist research is political. And yet we have had debates over and over again. We can go back to Max Weber's Methodenstreit with its contemporaries, or the Frankfurt School's understanding and development of critical theory, or various other examples. I'm thinking of Sandra Harding's work on science question and feminism, or George Reich's study of the transformation of US philosophy of science to the icy slopes of logic. This is the subtitle of his book, during the Cold War. The way we study things is not separate from the way the world works. the way that theory works is not entirely separate from the way that policy and politics work. So in some way, it's disingenuous to say feminism is a political project and the other kinds of science or research aren't, right? So let's just not do that, right? In actuality, of course, most research projects contain elements of traditional and critical thought. They have elements of describing the world as it is and finding ways to manage current structures and policies differently, and they have aspirational ideas in them, ways to think about how the world would be better or how we might emancipate one or another group. So what I'm saying here is that the dismissal of feminist scholarship, and for that matter, feminist foreign policy or other kinds of activism, as only political is not only a misrepresentation of how research works, but also itself a political move. And as the examples show, examples like the attack or the threat to the gender studies world, is political actors and radicals, particularly on the right, recognize this quite clearly. This is a political move. And we academics, sorry, academics here, should also recognize that if we replicate these same kinds of analysis, we are actually making political moves and we are playing right into the hands of those we might not quite agree with. So, lots of things to think about broadly. But let me turn to the question of feminist perspectives, again plural, because our vision of the world as well as of our ideas of what might be better and for whom are so deeply contextual, we are bound to have multiple overlapping and also at times contradictory feminisms and feminist perspectives. Examples here might include the state feminisms that we are quite familiar with in the Nordic countries, but also have found historically in places like Egypt, the Soviet Union, and in other places, where a particular version of feminism is sanctioned by the state and informs its policies on a variety of levels, from childcare to housing to labor laws to security policy indeed. Right? A different oppositional, in some sense, example might be post-colonial or indigenous feminisms that directly challenge modern state practices and the violence that's inherent in them. These two can be directly at odds with each other, even when a state might consider itself to be quite progressive. In the case of Canada, which also has announced that it's pursuing feminist foreign policy, I'm thinking of the Idle No More movement, which was started by a group of indigenous women, with the goal to stop environmental degradation and economic and social inequality, and which has links to similar movements in the US, the Lakota and Dakota who've been fighting the pipelines going across their lands, or indigenous activists such as the late Berta Cáceres in Honduras, who are protesting extractive industries in Central and Latin America. Indigenous feminisms and the ways in which their relation to the state works would not necessarily agree with some of the state feminisms. And of course, in between, we find a variety of other feminisms that are attuned to the particular context within which their grievances arise. As Maria Lugones and Elizabeth Spellman have noted, our vision of what is better are always informed by our perception of what is bad about our present situation. Indeed, how we think and what we think about those does depend in large part on who is there, right? Who is there in the room when these agreements are negotiated. Not to mention, of course, who is expected and encouraged to speak. While these questions are of concern in any research project, it's important to remember them specifically in feminist scholarship when it goes global, given historical and current power relations. Western feminists, and here I'm speaking to my own people, in particular need to be aware that from the vantage point of the colonized, the term research and policy is often linked directly to European imperialism and colonialism, right? What is it that we are bringing that is actually helping? How do we know? So, feminist scholarship, I would argue, and feminist policy making and activism clearly, on many levels, constitute a radical intervention, but one that is much more broadly relevant than outsiders often presume when they hear the word feminism. It reveals what has been taken for granted, for example, who gets to sit in the peace negotiations that Mr. Wallström mentioned. It gives us a set of new lenses to see the world. It reveals how institutions and practices, and hence our understandings of peace, security, international law, war, etc., are gendered, but not just gendered, right? They are also raced and classed and sexualized, shaped by colonialisms, indigeneity, ability, religion, and go on and on. So once we understand what is taken for granted and how that is shaped by existing power relations, and this is really what feminists do, we study power, right? It has taken a lot of power to make it appear as though the way the world works right now is the way it always has worked or always should work. Not that simple. It actually has taken power, as Cynthia Enloe has pointed out, for women not to hold land titles, right? For indigenous peoples not to be able to keep the rights to their traditional medicines or to the oil that is underneath the lands. So it has taken power to make the world appear as it does today, and we can gain better insights when we pay attention to these power relations and move beyond conflict and violence and to solving conflicts without resorting to violence. I want to give a few examples from the vast literature of feminist scholarships on gender, peace, and security. And in the Q&A and in the discussion, I'm sure we'll have lots more examples. And you actually already gave a great example on the FARC in Colombia. I'm also involved with the International Feminist Journal of Politics. I'm their digital media editor, and just a few days ago, I posted a new blog post from one of our authors, which talks specifically about the peace process in Colombia and how, feminists and women's movements are still hoping to push for more changes. Because it's great what's there, but we can push for more. So I was reading that a couple of days ago. So one of the examples I want to talk about is conflict transformation and peace processes, which are, of course, like all our world, right, deeply imbued with gendered assumptions. Take demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration efforts. Megan McKenzie, Helen Bassini, and Lena Vastapu have all shown that in the case of Liberia, there are lots of other examples, assumptions about women's and men's roles in fighting forces, as well as heteronormative conjugal orders, meaning who is marrying whom, and the fact that people are supposed to marry each other. These shape who has access to these efforts, right? Who gets to demobilize and disarm and reintegrate. Where resources are being assigned. And in the case of Liberia, these three scholars have demonstrated that this often leaves women, many of them former girl soldiers, it's a problematic term, to fend for themselves. And in this case, also set the stage for continued exploitation. Sex work is often an obvious choice for these women. We find this around conflicts that are being demobilized. We also find it with refugees who are being left to fend for themselves. And this also, not surprisingly, can often lead to further involvement in violence of some sort, gangs, drugs, and so forth. So the consequences for the individual girls and women and their children, often, are one thing. But there are other broader issues here for the peace process and the transformation of that process and the possibility of justice and not further violence that are really important to consider. So this is just one example of what feminist scholarship might do. Another example, and I know there are some people concerned here with this, are transitional justice processes that fail to properly address gendered violence due to a number of reasons. From the definition of what makes for political violence, for example, does rape count? Does rape count differently if it's happening within the context of institutionalized torture? Is it different if it happens on the side of the road or in a private bedroom? Does it matter whether it's women or men or girls or boys who are being raped? Who gets to talk about these things? And who gets taken seriously, right? So we know from a lot of work, for example, on the Congo, but also other places, former Yugoslavia comes to mind, that women are in many ways uniquely susceptible or uniquely injurable in some way through sexualized violence. But what we are finding more recently is that men also are experiencing a lot of this violence. I have found this in my own research on sexualized violence in the US military. While percentage-wise it affects women more than men, if we look at the actual numbers, men are also experiencing harassment, violence. So when we look deeper, we might also find that some men or some women, right, depending on their intersectional location with gender or class or ethnicity, are more vulnerable than others. In the US, we find currently domestically that it is particularly trans women who are being attacked, killed. So who counts? And even if it's the same, quote unquote, kind of violence, how does it get negotiated differently? When does it become political violence in the eyes of a transitional justice process? There's also the concern of thinking of women as a homogeneous group. My colleague Pasha Bueno Hansen has written up about the experience of Andean Quechua speakers who have experienced sexualized violence during the long war in Peru. But in the Peruvian Truth Commission, in the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, were unable to really work through their experiences because the setup was such that the testimony had to have a very particular shape, form, right? Their words were translated from Quechua to Spanish, but nobody translated the proceedings Quechua, right? So a much more inclusive process to think about how to incorporate indigenous cosmologies and languages and understandings of justice would be needed to really do justice to these women and their experiences of violence during the war, and to actually have peace and reconciliation. Context matters in so many ways. One of my favorite is the Women and Peace thesis, which continues in some ways to shape feminist research on war also. Are women inherent? According to the Women and Peace thesis, women are seen as peaceful, whether due to biology or their social role as mothers or some other form of thinking about their positioning, while men are considered the violent sex. Now, this theory has been thoroughly debunked by feminist scholars, but it still appears. We talk about, in the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and the following resolutions, about the women, peace, and security agenda. We need to look a little bit harder, because while it might be politically advantageous to posit women as peacemakers, and there certainly are many women peacemakers, right? You mentioned some examples from the Colombian peace process. We all probably know examples from our own communities and beyond. Seeing women only as peacemakers and having a simplistic relationship between the two is incorrect. It devalues women's work in other areas. It limits our understandings unnecessarily, and it also supports the status quo. It makes it hard for women who are not peacemakers to find a place within, and there are lots of ways to be not a peacemaker, be directly violent. So let's not quite have that thesis, or let's at least think about it much more hardly, much more comprehensively. And then finally, maybe, and I'm happy to provide a lot more examples, but an example from my own current work. I already mentioned that I've been doing work on women in the US military in terms of looking at the violence they experience, but I'm also looking more broadly at how the ways in which women are being integrated are shaped by intersections of gender, race, class, and so forth. What I'm finding is that Native women, for example, from the various tribes, Native tribes in the US, are overrepresented at a really high rate. How do we explain this, right? What is going on here? Is it simply a matter of a poverty draft, which is the concept we use to describe how many people are joining the military in the US to escape poverty, to be able to go to school, to be able to afford childcare or housing and so forth? Or is it also a matter of traditional notions of warrior culture and honor and heroism? Still working on that one, so I'll tell you later. The military has been the US military, I should say, has been an incredible opportunity for many black women, right? While many of them might have joined initially out of desperation, it has allowed them to be solidly middle class in the US context. Because the US military is one of the few institutions that actually pays equal money for equal work, right? So it means that the kind of racial discrimination that we see in US society at large, not, at least in the pay, talk about other things, present in the US. So when feminists, who have lots of different perspectives on, by the way, advocate for or against women being in the military, we need to take into account these specific issues, right? To say nobody should join the military means that you are preventing African American women, Native women, from establishing this lifestyle that they might not be establishing. So can you argue this without at the same time arguing for a change in society? Right? One of the other fascinating things, now I've talked, I'll go off topic a little bit, is the way in which the US military actually is the one organization that functions like a social security net. Yes. So healthcare, housing, childcare, maternity leave. So the US is the only country, besides Papua New Guinea, that doesn't have paid maternity. Not if you're in the US military. You can get paid maternity. The contradictions here are what interests me, right? Let's think a little bit harder. What does this do to our understandings of the world? Oops, and now I messed up my notes. I'm also interested in terms of the military, about the recent efforts to lift the combat exclusion. So in the US military, until fairly recently, women were excluded from certain combat positions. But when we think about combat, this was only really actually combat positions that were distinctly infantry positions, right? Women have long served or longer, I should say, since the early 90s, in combat positions in the Air Force, flying planes. At the same time, there was this understanding that women are still not in combat. How is this linked to our understanding of military masculinity? The ways in which the conduct and being of man and masculinity is deeply wrapped up in how we see the military and war, from foot soldiers, weapons experts, generals. The move to open combat positions in the US military offers an excellent case study to thinking about all of these things. How, we might ask, does the push to integrate women across all military occupations, jobs, another word for jobs, challenge notions of heroism and sacrifice? How does this vary across the different branches of the US military? How does this change as women are asked to do jobs, for example, on female engagement teams, IMS teams in the US involvement in Iraq, that men can't do because of assumptions about gender, such as searching other women or establishing rapport in counterinsurgency. So this picture is complicated by the fact that norms of masculinity, of course, are variable, right? Norms of masculinity, even within the different branches of the US military, thinking of the Marines who will fight with the Army or the Navy or, the Coast Guard. They don't even think the Coast Guard is real military. These kinds of different understandings of masculinity, of course, also differ, and I'm curious to learn what's. There are also differing among women and men, again, like I previously mentioned. They differ according to class. The ideal understanding here in the US military has to be white male. Right? Integration of women into the US military only became interesting when there weren't enough white men to fill the position. And when the military was worried that there would be too many untrusted, speak brown, others joining the forces. And the women that join the military tend to be more highly qualified. So these are also economic and other kinds of incentives. It's not just a feminist ideal at work here. And actually, I would dispute that it's a feminist impulse. It can be sold. One example here is the conditions under which drone pilots, controversy. Are drone pilots, can they be considered heroes, right? Because they are in combat, technically, but they are sitting in containers in the Nevada desert. So how might this or might this not challenge our understandings of heroism? And are they deserving of medals for heroism? So gendered hierarchies play into what we understand in these various contexts. Carol Cohn, of course, long time ago, described the rationality of civilian defense intellectuals that required a distancing from the violence that the weapons they actually do. She has a wonderful article that you should all read called The Rational World of Defense Intellectuals. The title is Sex and Death. Where she describes the way that the language prevents us from what is really happening. These are different forms of masculinity, but they do work in interesting and similar ways. We can see patterns, and we can, with these patterns, begin to understand a lot about what is taken for granted. And as I mentioned earlier, once we understand what is taken for granted, it makes it possible to think about ways to shift it. And of course, as societies and militaries, so do these norms though it's interesting to watch it and see that they sometimes change in rather unusual. So anyway, that's my research. It's one of my strands of research that I'm working on right now. Questions? So I want to caution once again that when we think about issues of peace, security, war, violence, all of these issues, these are often shaped by considerable economic interest, right? We cannot study security and peace and all of these issues without remembering that there is a political economy that is involved. We can probably talk about this a little bit more when we talk. So if feminist perspectives on peace and security and war and more are not intersectional and looking at the ways in which gender interacts with race and class, community, and political and economic necessity, they run the risk of replicating the very structures that they aim to resist or dismantle. Here, feminist security studies and also feminist peace research, two efforts I've been involved in, are developing an ever-increasing body of research that deserves to be taken seriously, read widely, and that deserves to inform policy and practice. So I hope that my presence here at the Swedish Defence University in this new position and the work that we'll be doing to develop this program can further contribute to the effort of bringing this to policy, practice, theory, and yes, the military, right? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wibben. And we will transfer to the chairs very shortly, but before that, I would like to give you an opportunity to ask a few questions directly to Professor Wibben related to her lecture or her agendas of research. Anything you'd like. Do we have a microphone as well somewhere?
It's on? Okay.
And please introduce yourselves as well while asking.
Walt Beiner. I'm a major in the U.S. Army and a student here in the War Studies program. Have you noticed a difference in, back to your research on gender integration in the military, have you noticed a difference in the rank and the views that soldiers or service members in the U.S. military have shown? And from my empirical experience, I find that the longer they've served, the less susceptible they are to something new in an organization that's so steeped in tradition, like this. But I have noticed in, for example, with the repealing of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and for time being, I guess, the transgender ban lift, that younger soldiers and people newer in the military were more susceptible. They didn't have any issues, whereas colonels and above seem to be afraid somebody's going to get beat up, some terrible things are going to happen. But in reality, soldiers are very accepting. Does this, to further abstract this, do you think that this is perhaps indicative of society, or perhaps change in society towards this as well?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. I would broadly agree with what you said. That's been my experience. There's a little bit of variation across the different branches as well. I mean, it's not for nothing that the Marine Corps basically kind of faked a study to make it, not possible, but to try to push back on gender integration. So there are the different traditions within the different branches definitely influence how this works. But I think that the fact that we are seeing particularly younger service members sort of going, right? It's kind of like, okay, next, is, I think, indicative of changes that are happening in society, right? So the military is not over here and society is over here and they don't interact, but of course they influence, shape each other all the time. And so when we speak about societal changes more generally, we see that it often takes that kind of generational change, right? And also, of course, you have the issue that by the time you have a 15, 20 year in the military, and you have become much more socialized into particular traditions, right? It's harder to move. I'm a little more jaded. Think about the age of the people who are making those decisions. It's a combination of factors, but I think that definitely it reflects in some sense broader changes in society. And it makes me wonder, right, as I'm talking to you about this, how this also is how the political reality, U.S. Congress, which is skews old broadly, right, also is sometimes having a harder time than I think the military, getting. So female engagement teams started to work in Afghanistan, and they were, essentially in combat positions, weren't allowed to officially be in combat positions because women weren't allowed to be in those positions. And so Congress got wind of it, and stopped it. And it was at odds with capacities where, but it was clearly indicative of older, sort of understandings. So I think that question of, I didn't mention age as one of my intersections, but that's with age. I haven't noticed as much of commission. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Come on.
Yeah, my name is Karin Olofsson, and I'm Secretary General of an organization called Parliamentary Forum on Small Arms and Light Weapons. And first, warm congratulations to you also, Professor Wibben. My question was exactly a bit about what you mentioned also in your response to the former question. What would you say, what have you came across in your research on the political role, the parliamentary role I'm thinking about in specific? We are working together, parliamentarians across the world and party political lines, and doing our contribution on policy building, capacity building. But what have you seen in your research? How can parliamentarians be true drivers for gender, peace and security globally?
Yes. So, not just because I'm an academic, but also more generally, I do think that we need to have these conversations more often, right? And I'm hoping that maybe we can start small in Stockholm, in Sweden, and then move from there. I'm thinking about the different contexts, right? The U.S. context is very particular, and I'm less familiar with the Swedish context. More room for interaction is for one. There's a more serious engagement, hopefully, I think, maybe between academics and policymakers. There's a way in which academics are taken more seriously. In the US, we often, there's a small slice of academics that gets to speak to policymakers, and there's a large slice that is somewhere else. So I think that is one thing I would say, that to actually see the way in which, we have particular issues. I think we do need to talk about very particular issues, and to bring together the best minds who are studying these issues with the people who are trying to make change, and to think through the different options. So more generally, I think that our role as academics who are we're basically paid to think about stuff, which is kind of cool. I like my job, and teach people things, but is really to take some of these questions and to think them through very deeply, and then to use our knowledge to both provide ideas and conceptions and so forth for parliamentarians and the public more generally, but also to push, right? To say, okay, what are you doing? Have you thought about this, right? Or taking the issue of weapons and arms sale, right? Can we have, on the one hand, a feminist foreign policy that comes up, right? And weapons. What happens, right? Need to really think about this. Can we support, right, or maybe other foreign policy regimes that are, we know are violating, right? But we want to do it. So these are the conundrums that I'm glad I don't have to decide, but I'm happy to think about and maybe provide insight about. And I think that there is, again, it's a three-way conversation between policymakers, activists. I think in that conversation, we get better at thinking about these issues. Yeah, I don't know if that's satisfactory, but.
My name is Åse Smedler, and I'm working for Operation 1325. And congratulations to your new professorship, and welcome to Sweden.
Thank you.
You gave us a lot of insight in your work during this presentation. And towards the end, you were also talking about the issue of violence against civil population. In terms of conflicts today, this is the large brunt of victims in a conflict. And my question is therefore, do you see, or is it possible to verify already, if the introduction of Security Council Resolution 1325 and continuous has had any practical implication on sort of breaking or relatively stopping civil violence against civil population? It is, of course, in accordance with international humanitarian laws, etc., but that's not enough. Has this practical issue been part of your discussions or research?
So, I want to say yes, but I think the jury is a little bit out on the question, right? I think that, so one of the things I would say to this is the question of national action, right? So 1325 biastic action plans, and this has become a really important thing, right? Now, I know there's research going on about what it actually, okay, one step is the creation of a national action plan. And then what does it actually do, and how does it shape, say a post-conflict environment, or shape a foreign policy? I think there's interesting work going on here, but I think the trend is positive, right? I think that the simple fact of more attention to these issues has helped, because we have, for example, a greater inclusion of women in these peace processes. There's a Nordic network of mediators, for example. These are efforts that have come out of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. There's more attention to women in peacekeeping operations, right? There's NATO has attempts to integrate gender, So I see a lot of activity, right? Whether it has made a real difference on the ground, particularly around the question of violence against civilians, which is where you are. I'm sort of going through my catalog of things I've read and things I know colleagues are working on. I haven't really seen a particular, I mean, yes, there are instances, but it hasn't created a so I think that there's more research to be done here. And actually, one of the things that I'm hoping to do as really gear up to do the work here is to bring a lot of the scholars who are working on these issues to this defense, talk about this. So I invite you already to come back and have those conversations with us as these scholars come. So.
Okay, I'd like to invite you to the chairs. Madam Minister. Nick, wash them. Where's the protocol section when you need it? Again, thank you so much, both of you, for coming. Please take a deep breath and have something to drink, Professor. I'd like to start out by taking us back to the fall of 2014. I assume that you have just received a call from the newly elected Prime Minister, and you're giving your very first interviews. And you immediately announce a Swedish feminist foreign policy. And I have to ask, whatever gave you that idea? Where did that inspiration come from?
Well, from my own experience, I would say, and also that I recently, of course, had finished also my term as a special representative on conflict-related sexual violence, but also the fact that for many years I've been working on gender issues like gender equality, and I think it was a way of defining it that would fit into. I had thought carefully, of course, although shortly, about what is it that I want to do as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Luckily, we have a lot of consensus on the foreign and security policy in Sweden, which is an enormous asset. And luckily, we do not have too many political quarrels about the foreign policy. But I wanted to add a few things to what is already the platform that we stand on and the things that we have in common. So I said that we need to, of course, ensure that we have peace in our neighborhood, and the whole issue of our relation to Russia and Russia's aggression would be at the center of very much of what we were doing when it comes to security policy. But we also had to do more on, and we announced the candidacy for the Security Council, which was a kind of shift towards saying that not only as the European Union is our main platform for foreign policy, but not only, we also have to be active in the United Nations. And I said that we also need to engage much more and open up the foreign policy, the sort of foreign ministry also for civil society organizations. And this was, and they all started with an F. Folklig, I'm sorry, but in Swedish it was all sort of an F. Fred och frihet och vårt närområde. Folklig förankring, FN i fokus. And also feminist foreign policy. So it was a way of describing what I wanted to do. We need to put more focus on engaging women and focusing on gender equality. So there can be no sustainable peace if women are excluded, subordinated in a way that is really a discrimination, you might say. So. But I am very practical. This is one thing that I reacted. Thank you for your excellent lecture. One thing that I reacted to, because you could, of course, be totally absorbed by discussing also the sort of theoretical basis for all of this. And I know that there were many who wanted to get us into that discussion, but I decided that this has to be practical. It has to be practical. It has to be something that we can do in every situation, also in the Security Council, serving on the Security Council, or in the European Union. So that is why the question, where are the women, has been leading us. And it starts with that. Because if they are not represented, so that's why I defined it also and had to define it clearly, what are the parameters to use. And I said that it is about rights, representation, and resources. And this is also how we have been using it through all our embassies around the world. Sorry, long answer to your short question, but this is how it has developed over.
Yeah, and I actually wanted you to expand a little on what a feminist foreign policy actually meant to you, what it should entail, because you've had a chance to develop it now for a number of years. So what's the elevator pitch now?
Yeah, no, that's exactly to define to say that we all have to check it against, do women enjoy the same, or if you're a hen, if you're not a woman or a man, you don't define yourself, whatever you are. So do we enjoy the same rights as men? Are we represented? Are we there at the table where important negotiations are taking place, or where decisions are being made, or where important things happen, processes happen? And then also the resources. So from a budgetary point of view, are resources allocated also to the needs of women? And I think this leads us a long way if we can use these parameters in everything. And that's what we do through our embassies around the world as well. We look at, are the laws discriminatory against women? Why are there child marriages? What about the rights for girls and women? We look at whether they are represented in parliaments and in governments, or in the boards of companies. Do they have the same economic? Can they open a bank account? And also we look at when we give, when we look at the budgets or the resources or the aid that we provide, the development assistance. Are they directed also to the needs of girls and women?
Thank you very much. Yeah, do.
Okay.
Please.
Because I like the question, right? Where are the women? And I am inspired always here by Cynthia Enloe, who's a amazing feminist scholar, has worked on these issues for a long time. And I remember when I was younger, still young, I think, that I thought, where are the women? It's just like not enough of a feminist question. But I realized over time that it leads us to all these places, right? Because when we actually really seriously look at where women are, and not in that homogeneous sense of all the women, but really look at, what are the needs of particular women in particular contexts, right? Over time, how are they changing? Who do we consider to be a woman, right? There is some conversation, there are some people who are saying that trans women can't be real women, right? So, but if we look at the specifics of all these people, what are women doing and what are their needs, we actually get quite far, right? I mean, then academics come in and we put a bit more, but I think we do the question, where are the women and the men, right? We can also look at those with their various needs, actually really gets us quite far. And I think it's encapsulated in that statement I was talking about earlier from Christine Sylvester, that we can talk about them as a group, as stick figures, and that's important for academics.
What is stick figures?
A stick figure is like like this, like a stick figure. Yes. But then we realized this is not a person we can talk to. But for academics, we often need to make broad statements about groups of people. So in one sense, we want to have the ability to say women do X, but at the same time, we also need to really be specific about, for example, what is going on when we are trying to provide justice for a particular group of people within a conflict or something like that.
And remember that, as the World Bank showed in a report, a recent report also, there are still more than 100 countries that have laws that prohibit women from taking on certain jobs. Even a country like France has laws that stops women from taking on certain jobs, like driving. I think that was where they cannot drive a subway train or things like, or carry. Well, maybe that was not. That was probably Russia that has, like, I don't know how many jobs that women cannot take on, but there in France, I remember that there were rules about how heavy they could lift. So if it was more than, I don't know, 20 kilos, so we were saying like a child, then they cannot take on those jobs where they have to do heavy lifting. But so there are, and it has worked also in the Security Council, because every country situation in the Security Council, we've had to ask, and we've kept on asking. So where are the women? Are they mentioned? Are their needs addressed in the resolutions or in the presidential statements or in the products from the Security Council? Are they there in the particular situation where things are negotiated, et cetera, et cetera? So you have to use it in a very practical way, because I think we have so many fantastic objectives and targets and goals set up, and we have so many documents where all of this is being described, but we now need to turn words into deeds, and that's where we are with all of this in the world. And still, we have so many situations where, we had people from Yemen actually coming to Stockholm, and it was only one woman in one of the delegations. And we of course tried to influence this early on to make sure that then there was a technical advisory group with 8 women, fantastic women, of course, very knowledgeable on everything. But we are still not there, so we have to continue to ask the question. Mm-hmm.
Something that's really intrigued me is how this has all been received. Because you didn't just decide to pursue a women, peace and security agenda, you actually put the dreaded F word in our foreign policy. And my question is, from your perspective, how has this been received within the ministry, but also in your international network of colleagues?
I think it quickly turned from, I used the Gandhi quote about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. So I think that it was a good tactic, and this is, I think, what happened. First, they tried to laugh at it. What on earth is this? And of course, it has a negative connotation in some countries. So it was looked as a very extreme position, but then it turned into curiosity. So all the ministers or ambassadors that came to me, they started by saying something, well, now we have actually 2 women in our government. So they knew that they were coming to somebody that had announced a feminist foreign policy, and that would entail something like that. And then they started to ask, what does that mean in practice? How do we pursue that or implement it at the country level? And this is where it was needed to define it, just to use those 3 R's, the rights, representation, and resources point. And I think that has worked throughout. It's still sort of a manageable, those are manageable parameters. But so I think it has turned from into respect. And I think when other countries start to announce that they will also pursue a feminist foreign policy, I think it has worked.
Professor Wibben, you were in San Francisco when all of this happened. Did the news reach you very quickly, or how would you see?
Please say yes. please.
Yes. No, they actually did reach me very quickly, because the feminist world in some way is small enough, but also because I got an email from, I think, the Swedish National Radio, saying, can we talk to you about feminist foreign policy? And I'm like, feminist foreign policy? Sure. Can we talk tomorrow so I can do a little research? And so I immediately got involved in the conversation. And I think it was interesting because there was sort of a, I think I should know what it is, but I'm not quite sure. So, but we have enough knowledge about feminist things, foreign policy things, security issues that then I think you did the same as well. We started to think about, okay, what does it mean, and what could it look like? And I think it was very exciting for feminist scholars to see that here it was. Somebody actually said it and put it out there, and it gives it gives us something to work with in that sort of conversation that I think we are all part of, right? Where we push each other to think about these things, because I then went back and I looked at, okay, has there been any writing on feminist foreign policy previously? Has anybody thought about this? And I found a few little examples here and there. I have a paper under review on these issues for academics that know these things. And it's interesting. There were like snippets and pieces, but there wasn't, nobody had ever embraced it in that way. And so I think it has energized feminist scholars to think about their work as well as, policy relevant in a new way.
Can I rephrase my answer to your first question also? Because I think what happened was, when you're first, of course, if you announce something like this and it's a new concept and it's not sort of fully implemented yet, because we had to start at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, to make sure that we had everyone on board. And I think that happened very quickly, because everywhere around the world, I would say our ambassadors could clearly see that this is necessary. It's necessary to work on gender equality, on this kind of approach. And now we created a concept for that, and we made a definition. So we had to work on it along the way. But I think and I would like you maybe to comment on that. Don't you see that? Don't you feel that there is clearly such a heavy, I wouldn't say backlash, but it's a kickback from a number of a number of men who of course don't like what they hear. They don't like this, and I think it was interpreted quickly as if we would make this our only priority. And this is, of course, entirely wrong. I think it is a matter of integrating it in everything we do. We have been working very, very actively in the European Union on the peace and security agenda. I mean, that has taken most of my time. So the normal business of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But of course, this has been announced and recognized in the media in such a way that people seem to think that I don't do anything about anything else, but it's all about these women and the feminists. You can see that they really hate it in some quarters, and I think that is also what we've seen. But I think as such, and sort of at the formal level, it has really been met with respect. But don't you feel the same thing, that there is a true kickback, like maybe not in many years we've seen it. So it's threatening what we are doing as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what you were sort of implying when you said the F word, right? There is some sense, and I think I don't know enough about how the conversation functions in Sweden yet, but I know that when I have taught classes on feminist international relations, things like that, the students often also come in with this, I don't know that I'm feminist, right? It's sort of man-hating. Right?
As if we were man.
As if we were, right? Yes, there are. So that's what I was trying to get at earlier in my talk as well, is that it's by asking feminist questions or proposing, to ask where are the women and making a statement about feminist foreign policy, you are changing the whole conversation, right? So it's never just about women in some way, even though asking where the women are might reveal all these other things. Right? It's always also about all these other things. When feminist researchers do work, we also don't just look at this narrow slice of just what the women are doing, but we do that as we do all these other. Like, as for example, we think about peace processes or transitional justice processes and all of these things. And actually, what happens sometimes is that, and I have an edited collection called Researching War with a bunch of different people's case studies in it. And what happened in some of the cases where people started with a question about where are the women, but ended with a question about what men were doing or how religion actually shaped the conflict or something like that. So it's, I think for feminist scholarship, it's a lens we use to begin asking questions. But then what we find, right, at least one would hope so, that when we do research or policy or something, we don't ask the question thinking we already have the answer, but we ask the question to see what the lay of the land is. And the lay of the land might be about all sorts of other things. And then the other thing I think I would say, which also relates to something I said earlier, is that when we don't reflect on these issues, right, it becomes threatening and personal, right? Because of course, right, if your example about women not being allowed to do certain jobs, well, if those jobs are open to women, then there might actually be some women who want to take those jobs. And so some men who have those jobs might feel threatened by the fact that there might be women taking those jobs. And so in some way, it's a real material worry that they have. Like, it's a real challenge to their understanding of self, right? And we see this, I think, we can think about xenophobia and opposition to refugees and people fleeing violence that are coming into Europe as well, that there is a sort of, oh, this is going to threaten me and my livelihood, and so I don't like it.
It's the politics of power, of course. I mean, in the end, it's a matter of sharing power, and it becomes threatening. But we also have experienced here a kind of new debate about what is a real man, and a real man shouldn't be so engaged in equality. And there are some lead figures who have now been sort of lifted up, and I think I find it a rather fascinating debate. But I guess it has become personal. It has become something that men fear. Will this change us so that we are no longer men or something else? I don't know what you say.
And I think the Me Too movement challenged men as a community to think very hard about what it means to be a man. What do I do in my everyday life? What are my responsibilities, not just to behave well, but also to stop violence when I see it around me, or power behavior in the workplace, for example. But you're both talking a bit about resistance right now. And I'd like to push you a little bit on that, because I have to wonder, have there not been occasions as foreign minister when this has been a problem for you? When you felt that, oh, being a female foreign minister launching a feminist foreign policy has been unhelpful in my relations to certain countries or in certain... I'm obviously slightly referring to the Saudi Arabia affair, for example.
No, no. You know what? I think if you stick your neck out, if you declare that you're going to pursue a feminist foreign policy, you create animosity. In the worst case, you create expectations, you create an agenda for yourself, and you create also risks. But I think you are very clear. They know where you stand. So also to those who with whom we disagree and agree to disagree, they find it very very clear what my position is. It is easier to relate to somebody that you know where they are, and hopefully, I mean, we have excellent relations with, I would say, almost all countries in the world. We have good diplomatic relations with the whole world. And of course, through what we've done in the Security Council, we have also increased our own security. We have played a very important role, as we do in the European Union. And I think we've gained respect. And not that we have suddenly got enemies or more enemies, but we have very different policies and views on, and they know that, and we can talk about it. And that's how we have to engage. So, but I mean, that goes with the job, that it is always a matter of how do you find that kind of fine balance, and how do you engage with also those countries that we disagree with. So it's an absolutely relevant question.
Professor Wibben talked about scholars, policymakers, and activists, and we can add practitioners perhaps to that list as well. You've brought a number of them into the policymaking process by inviting civil society groups, for example, into a number of working groups and advisory councils, etc. But how useful have you found the academic community while pursuing this agenda? Have we been there for you?
No, I think that we are helped enormously by research being done on these areas, because not everything is researched. So there are so many new areas where we need better knowledge and better scientific proof also. And we have been looking for that because we want to give the examples. And there are not many studies made on, for example, the usefulness of engaging women in the peace processes, but we are using to the full those reports and studies that we have on the effects of this. So we need to do more there. And I also think what you mentioned already, some of these studies on the military and the whole military world is also very, very useful to us. I mean, what about military doctrines? And how can we do more there? And I recall that we discussed that also when I was in the UN and working on these issues on sexual violence. What does the military doctrine say about this? Can we do more there? And how do we engage everybody? And if you compare the US and to your question, I think here actually our Supreme Commander, our Supreme Commander Mikael Bydén, I think he's such a role model, because I mean he's been very clear about what he intends to pursue and what sort of his orders are, and he has really taken bold steps to engage in debates about rape as a weapon in war. He has been very clear on these issues. He even marched in the
Pride Parade.
The Pride Parade in Stockholm. So I think, that something like that would happen, and that he's so clear, it sends also a message throughout the system.
Professor Wibben, this position is obviously a way to strengthen the academic community on these issues. What do you think we can do more in order to build that bridge between theory and practice, or the scholarship and policy making?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things. I mean, one is to really, there are several places in the world where this kind of scholarship is happening in like a type of center or something, and so this I'm hoping will be one of the places where the kind of scholarship actually happens, but also where we bring together the scholars that are already doing this kind of work in Sweden, for example, or across the Nordics, or across Europe, or beyond, right? So networking the kind of scholarship that exists, and having these conversations, building on each other's research, pushing ourselves to be, clearer and stronger in some of these conversations, and then to bring scholars who are doing this work that you are also interested in, and others might be interested in to the Defense Academy to present on their work, or to do other to invite those that are interested from the policy and activist and practitioner world to have these conversations, and to say, we really would like to know more about these things. And somebody usually knows somebody who actually is doing work on these issues, right? So the feminist community is quite well networked. And so I often come across somebody who's saying, "Oh, I'm wondering about this," and I'm like, "Oh, if I ask so and so might know somebody who is working on these things," because of course not all the research is immediately published, or is published in such a way that it's immediately accessible. A lot of the community of scholars that has been doing this work has grown exponentially in the last, I would say, 20 years or so, and there's an increasing number of doctoral students and master's students doing interesting work on these issues. So I think that there is much more coming. I'm actually working as an external faculty member with somebody who's looking specifically at peace processes and mediation and the role of women. So, but the work has not been published yet because she's working on it.
But maybe you can start a series of events, or a big event annually, or together with both the parliament or and us in the MFA or other actors, and we can make it a really big, even international happening. That would be fantastic. That would be in the spirit of Anna Lindh as well, to think globally, or European and globally, about it.
I'm definitely planning on it. I already have ideas. We can talk more.
I thought I would open up for some more questions from the audience. If the microphone could be traveling around a little bit. So there's 3 on the right side here. We'll collect a few questions. So the 3 of you, go ahead, please.
Good morning. I'm Kiran Kothari. I work at Save the Children here in Sweden. I'm an advisor on child protection in conflict and on relations with armed actors. It was really interesting. Thank you. I would also remind the leaders in the room that practitioners includes humanitarians. That's just a footnote. We are humanitarians, and we put a lot of your policies that you determine as donors into practice. So please think of us, and please bear us in mind. Just 2 points. One was, in terms of this is to Professor Wibben, but what swayed change in relations to military and armed actors' behavior? Do you have any great examples when you've been thinking about masculinity? Because we engage with armed actors, and we use fatherhood and parenthood as an entry point through using sort of Swedish and Canadian models of positive discipline in everyday parenting, for example. That's one thing. And to the foreign minister, how do you juggle competing priorities like 1325 with the responsibilities that you've shouldered as leading the working group on children armed conflict that Sweden's done so well, and you've championed child protection functions and so on? There's a lot of, there can be at times competition between those 2 agendas, and how have you managed that, if you have? And finally, just as a further footnote, did your track record on Saudi Arabia help Sweden being seen as a credible facilitator for the Yemen process? Thanks.
Annika. Right back, Annika. Yeah, we'll take 3 questions.
Thank you ever so much for this lovely event. I'm Annika Bergman Rossman, and I'm an associate professor at Lund University in the politics department. And I wanted to ask our foreign minister in particular how you envisage the future of feminist foreign policy against the backdrop of the current governmental crisis that we're facing here. Because being a supporter and a believer in feminist foreign policy, I myself, I have my doubts as to the future should we see different constellations of government coming into place. My second question was that I think that as much as we're seeing a lot of examples of global feminism emerging, connecting the world, if you like, we also have a very strong sense of a feminist backlash with a lot of gendered violence being reported daily. And how does that impede upon the 1325 agenda, I wonder?
Thank you very much. Petra Tötterman-Andorf, and I'm the Secretary General of the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation. And I would like to connect to you how you ended your question here on the actually global threat against women human rights defenders, and not just specifically in conflict-affected areas and countries, but actually all over the world. And we know the importance of women's civil society in pushing for the adoption of Resolution 1325, and we know how often women's civil society organizations are actually the implementers of the practice of supporting women that have been exposed to violence, but also pushing for women's participation in peace processes and in political agendas in general. So like if all three of you could reflect on that, because I would say that there's a global emergency when it comes to democracy, women's rights, and being a women human rights defender is probably one of the most dangerous jobs you can have right now.
Right, lots to think about. You can pick and choose whatever you like. Professor, would you like to go first?
Ooh, okay, easy question. Thank you. I think I'll start with the one, sort of the last one, and then maybe go back and forth and turn to the others. But I do worry about this backlash, and like part of me wants to think that it's the pendulum, right? That as we see progress, we see countries embracing a feminist foreign policy, women being more visible in various positions, that there is sort of this, it feels threatening to many, and that we have this backlash as a result, and then hopefully we'll swing back eventually, and so that's my long view. The more immediate question is, I guess, for countries like Sweden and others that are supporting these various women human rights defenders. I'm also thinking of environmental activists. This has been a huge issue also in Latin America in particular. What are the ways in which that we can support the people doing the work on the ground, right? I think what has happened is that both feminist scholarship and feminist foreign policy activities have made it visible in a way that it maybe wasn't visible before, which makes it also maybe more easily attackable, right? So how do we move from this visibility to a sort of protection that makes it possible to continue the work? And I think that when it becomes normal in some way, that women need to be in all these places, that is when hopefully we will see less of these attacks. But I think that it is partly due to this visibility that we are seeing more of these attacks. So I don't want to go back to not being visible, right? But I think it's sort of hopefully a phase that we move through. And I think that what you said earlier about the clarity right? So that in a case, because you are being very clear about where you stand, other people have to interact with you in this way. And I think the clarity about saying this is not acceptable, right? It's not acceptable to kill journalists, for example, which is another category of people that have been attacked worldwide more recently. It's not acceptable to jail academics, right? We also have seen this, including in Europe. Well, if you count Turkey as Europe, I guess, or Hungary. To be very clear on what is and isn't acceptable, and to work towards a consensus globally within the EU, within the UN, within other kinds of institutions, to make that very clear that this is simply not acceptable. I think that can go some way towards it. Those are some thoughts. I'll give it to you, and then I might come back to the other question.
I think that all of these questions lead to a kind of reflection on where is the world going? What is it that we are seeing right now? And I think we have to realize that there is a real threat and a backlash to all of us who believe in democracy, to defend human rights, the rule of law, the UN Charter, international cooperation or multilateralism. And clearly this is sort of under threat or pushed back, experiencing a pushback today. There is also the polarization that we see within the European Union and in our own societies and everywhere in the world. Maybe it comes with the job to worry and not to sleep well during nights, and I think that there have been such occasions, but I think it is also an obligation on anyone that has a political engagement to look at, so where are sort of the good forces here? How do we position ourselves? What role do we take on, and how do we do it together with others? And I think it's very important to continue to defend what is the basis of our foreign policy and the basis of our society. And it has to do with defending democracy and democratic engagement and involvement. It has to do with defending a generous development policy. It has to do with believing in the European Union as our main platform and the United, the UN as another of our sort of most important venues for acting. And we have to see also that there is an enormous backlash and the threats against femme defenders, those defending women, but also journalists. So many journalists and minorities being killed every year. So it's a very worrisome world. And to add to that, we have the threats from more countries getting nuclear weapons and the armament sort of movement that we also see, the militarization. So I think that this is where we have to be clear, and it helps us to be clear on what our position is and where we want to put our priorities. So it will not be easier. I think to go back to, so this is, I really think that for a new government, whenever we get one, we are of course only a caretaker government at the moment, but we continue to, we haven't noticed that much of change. I have to tell you, in our daily workings, of course we have to anchor everything with the opposition and so on, but we have to carry on. The world does not stand still and wait for us to form a government, so we have to take more and more positions as well and be prepared for that. We continue to do our job, but we see that there are so many also very threatening things happening at the moment than prepared. So we have to all the time juggle these priorities. That was one of your questions. I think our experience from the Security Council was that those different responsibilities enriched each other or informed each other in a way that helped us, but also made it absolutely clear that we need UN reform, that we need to change our way of working so that we have this more of a holistic approach to peace building, peacekeeping, and everything that is being discussed in the UN today. It was not a problem, something that we saw as problematic, but really something that we took very seriously and where I think we made a difference and much as we could. And it has been an amazing experience also for us that I think has been good for our country as well as for others. And with the Saudis, we absolutely used our contacts with the Saudis, as well as Iran, as well as the US, as well as all difficult actors and proxy actors that we've seen in the Yemen conflict, to discuss with them. We've had really good relations with all of these countries in trying to get them to make the right moves to get the Stockholm Agreement in place. I must say that was one of the more exciting experiences and that I've had also with, you remember when I made that statement about the Saudis, same people that then attacked me for saying those things now accuse me of being, too lenient against the Saudis, saying, why don't you do this or that? They were very wise. Or quiet or very critical against me. Now they've changed their opinion. I think, again, what we have created is a situation where we have received respect for our position. They know exactly. Very often we start conversations also at the diplomatic level by saying, well, you know what we know that we will criticize you on how you deal with respect for human rights or the rule of law. You know where we stand, and we repeat our criticism. This is what we expect you to do. But we can still continue with an open and constructive dialogue. That's how diplomacy has to happen. And of course, we are proud that we would be such a place, that all these actors accepted, because we are not a military threat to any of these countries. We are not a former colonizer. We are a country that sort of has a generous development policy, and they know we believe in multilateralism in this dialogue, and that's why I think they also chose. I don't know about the new government. I know that what they've said, some of them have said, no, we won't call it that, which I think is, of course, they lose the whole point. But I will let them answer. I think there is a safe way to avoid the ambivalence, of course.
Yeah. I can perhaps take a stab at that question as an outsider analyst of feminist foreign policy.
No, I become too political. I think you are so right in pointing out the problems of the gender violence and how this has spread over. So, and I don't think we have. I'm against looking at this as, well, these are natural waves in history, and maybe it will just pass, and we will suddenly experience something.
No, not suddenly,
no,
for sure.
No. And,
I'm just
but
hoping
not even.
that
I don't think so. I really think we have to fight very hard, because otherwise we will lose a lot of the things that we have experienced, a lot of the things that we have changed over time. We have to work with men and to understand that it's a better world for both men and women, or whatever gender you belong to, whatever group you belong to in society, and for our children. And I think most importantly, we have to change our time perspective, because now it's so short-sighted. Everything is so short-sighted, when we more than ever need a long-term perspective. And climate change is the obvious example of this, but also many other things that we want to do. We need to think about children and grandchildren. What are we going to tell them? What is it? What kind of world do we want? And what are the messages to them?
I'll take a little stab as well at these questions. First of all, the future of feminist foreign policy. What excited me the most about the change processes of feminist foreign policy when I studied it was not the initiatives, the new policies, the network of mediators, for example, female mediators, but rather the internal organizational changes that have been going on within the ministry for a number of years. So the education of all the staff, the new procedures. We have Ann Bernes in the audience here who have been working on this very hard. These things will stick, exactly. And I think we will see the fruits of it in the decades to come, to be honest, because it's a new generation of diplomats who've been growing up within the system. So I'm not really concerned about the content of the policy. The name feminist foreign policy, I think that is your brand, so it's hard to see someone else take it over. On the other hand, it's hard to see someone dismiss it when the whole world has grown accustomed to it. So then they would have to explain, why aren't you pursuing it anymore? And then the obvious answer would be, well, actually we are, but we don't call it that anymore, which is not a very exciting policy to be driving either. The third very serious question about what is going on in the world right now, the book I would be writing if I had time right now is feminist foreign policy in the world of the strong man, to highlight the polarization that is going on. We're seeing two completely different trends moving in different ways. There are followers to feminist foreign policy. France and Canada, the Netherlands are also right up there, who are following in your footsteps, but there are also really strong reactionary forces of populism out there. So what is going on? Is this just a little dip in an otherwise progressive historical trajectory, or are we back in the 30s with a real challenge to our democratic societies again? I don't know, to be honest. I think the important thing to remember, and then putting on the activist's hat, that is that we are not simply riding the train of history. We are the makers of history and society. So if we want to see certain results, we'll have to fight for it. We can't just sit back and allow the world to happen around us. We have to make it happen in a direction that we'd like to see fit. Not a very comfortable role for academics, perhaps, but sometimes we have to go there with the knowledge we have.
I think that deserves an applause.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I am so grateful to all of you for coming. Some of you from just within the house to welcome our new professor, but some of you have traveled very far to receive her, and that is incredibly nice of you and shows the interests in these questions all over Sweden and internationally. Annick, again, you are most welcome to the Swedish Defence University. We are all excited about what you're going to achieve here. And
I need some help.
Absolutely. And you need funding, obviously. And Madam Foreign Minister, thank you so much, not just for the work you have done leading up to this, thinking about how we can advance these issues, but also for showing up today and launching this new chair in gender, peace and security. Thank you both, and thank you to the audience. I think you really deserve an applause now for this. So let me just be so presumptuous and say welcome back for these rounds of international seminars on gender perspectives on peace and security that we'll have in the future.
Yes.
Welcome back.
Yes. Thank you.